Hello, my name is Oliver Belcher, and I'm this year's recipient of the Antipode Graduate Student Scholarship.
Peace. Huh. Peace. Power.
Well, the title of my dissertation comes from a book published by a former Defense Department official named Seymour Dyckman, who worked in the Pentagon as a researcher under Defense Secretary McNamara. His book, The Best Laid Schemes, is a sort of insider's account into how during the Cold War, the U.S. military was employing and integrating the research of social scientists into military strategies and tactics, particularly in what some Pentagon researchers called techniques for predicting revolutionary behavior for defense use. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, this exploded into a huge row in the United States over how university research was being used to, quote, pacify people's rebellions against colonial powers in the global South, in a doctrine called then as now counterinsurgency. One particular military project called Project Camelot was especially controversial and was shut down after congressional hearings revealed that the work of social scientists was being used to train right-wing paramilitaries and armies in Latin America in psychological warfare and other, well, unsavory methods and activities like torture. This controversy over Project Camelot severed ties between American universities and the U.S. military for several years, especially in the social sciences. One can see this, of course, in the sort of left turn that many social science departments took in the 1970s away from quantitative questions oriented towards various modes of social engineering to more qualitative questions about power, class, identity, etc. But after September 11th, there was a sort of rapprochement between some social scientists and the military, especially after the Iraq War increasingly was realized among the political classes as a mounting disaster. And between the 2005 and 2006, with Iraq increasingly spinning out of control, the U.S. military resuscitated a counterinsurgency doctrine, which really had been shunned after the U.S.'s defeat in Vietnam. In writing the now infamous Counterinsurgency Field Manual 324, which is a bestseller, published by University of Chicago Press, the U.S. military actively recruited journalists and social scientists to help write a new version of counterinsurgency doctrine for the present. And people's careers really were made working with the military, people like Montgomery Fate and Sarah Sewall. In 2007 and 2008, the U.S. military began to deploy so-called human terrain teams, these sort of militarized anthropologists and sociologists, notoriously not very good ones, mind you, into various towns in Iraq in order to gather cultural intelligence and put a human face on the American and British occupation. This marked what my friend Derek Gregory, an advisor, called the quote-unquote cultural turn in the U.S. military. This whole shift towards social science within the U.S. military is what caught my interest for this project. And after I began to look into it, I discovered that there was this whole underbelly to the social sciences in the U.S. who've long been intertwined with U.S. foreign policy in ways that many of us in academia today, I think, would find surprising. Yes, well, counterinsurgency is, in the last instance, a Janus-faced affair. There's a sort of rhetorical side to counterinsurgency that has been sold to domestic publics in the United States and Europe, where counterinsurgency is presented as this sort of panacea to win the so-called hearts and minds of occupied populations, such as those in Afghanistan and Iraq, through the implementation of various development projects and effective governing structures. In more honest times, we used to call this propaganda. Although I should say that there are military officers who genuinely believe in the virtues of this doctrine, people like Andrew Exum and David Kilcullen. In my dissertation, I argued that when one looks, however, at the so-called technical register by which the U.S. military conducts counterinsurgency, we see something else entirely than winning hearts and minds. The essence of counterinsurgency is really about population control and killing insurgents. Protecting the population, and this means a highly particular thing within the U.S. military, is central to counterinsurgency, and it operationally results in the blurring of civilian and combat spaces. This blurring is justified as inevitable by counterinsurgency advocates because, as former NATO commander Rupert Smith put it in his book, The Utility of Force, warfare now happens, quote, amongst the people. Christian Parenti, I think, offers a useful summary of the doctrine when he says that counterinsurgency targets the capillary level of social relations. We have to realize that counterinsurgency is a theory of internal warfare. And that means that practitioners of counterinsurgency have devised a whole compendium of techniques designed to separate a loosely defined friendly population from the enemy. On the one hand, the U.S. military has adopted many of the techniques familiar to the colonial powers that have been written about by historians of colonialism, techniques like taking a census or training police and local defense forces, developing a penal apparatus, etc. However, the military has also integrated much more recent technical innovations like biometrics, drone use, and database management in order to quantify and track Iraq and Afghan populations through methods like social network analysis. And it's really this technical register, that I trace out. It's the technical register that I trace out in my dissertation by asking this sort of basic Foucauldian question of what are the conditions of possibility for these military knowledges and technical apparatuses for knowing, so to speak, occupied populations.
Understand the transition right now.
Yes, my work is based on 2 years of archival research at the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, as well as archival research at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I've also done some observations of counterinsurgency training at various U.S. military bases, which has been a highly interesting experience. But more broadly, I should say that my interests are much more theoretically inclined, since I'm largely influenced by people like Michel Foucault and Martin Heidegger and artists like Jay Dilla, Madlib, Vasily Kandinsky. A lot of my writing works through the military to tackle questions around more theoretical concerns like continuity and discontinuity in epistemological fields, what the dissemination of digital techniques means for questions of representation and power. What do we mean exactly by this concept of late modern warfare? For example, in an article I'm writing as we speak, called The Art of War in the Age of Digital Producibility, I interrogate how modern meanings of the real have changed through digital imagery, the same kind of imagery used by the military to raise entire villages in the countryside of Afghanistan, where methods such as pattern of life analysis, which uses full motion video from a drone to analyze social relations over entire towns, techniques like that are used to determine whether entire areas and people count as enemy spaces or not. So my interests largely lie there in the intersection between warfare and aesthetics, and how the use of social scientific knowledges lend themselves to particular forms of graphical representations. For example, whenever we see, graphics of social networks, it's at this end, I think, this theoretical end, that I think is integral. It's important, indispensable, that we can begin to interrogate what we mean by late modern warfare and how counterinsurgency which I just say is now largely a dead doctrine again, how counterinsurgency fits within that larger military power knowledge matrix. And that's an important question because a lot of those, as historians such as Alfred McCoy or people like Derek Gregory have shown, a lot of those techniques that have been developed in colonial spaces have been reintegrated in domestic spaces. And we can see this now in the Occupy Wall Street protests, where a lot of the techniques used by the police to disperse crowds were in fact refined in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.